is the Milwaukee Bucks and with Giannis, because there's lots of question marks, like just kind of hitting all around. So to join us to talk a little more about the Milwaukee Bucks and what the status of the situation is here this offseason, Justin Garcia joins us here, Locked On Bucks. Correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, but like what I saw last night, and this is what's important, and the funny thing of it is, the Milwaukee Bucks, when they won their title, this is what was important to them. You had to have the right role players, and you had to have guys that were going to step up in clutch situations where they controlled the clock, they controlled the opportunities that they saw when it came to opening up and spreading the perimeter and then getting the much-needed shots and then keeping the leads. That is what makes a team win a title from there, because of all of those things coming together. I mean, last night was a perfect example of why you needed to have a consistent bench. I mean, is that kind of just the secret sauce to some of these teams to win a title?
Well, I mean, I think, and after the Pacers beat the Bucks in the first round for a second consecutive season, we were talking about it on our show, and I work on the Bucks radio network too, and was talking about it on another show, in that I just think the Pacers are going to win the East. When you look at how they're structured and coming into this series, part of it was you wanted to be the outlier, and it's boring to just say, hey, I think the Thunder are going to win in 5. But another part of it is seeing what this team was able to do to the Bucks, to the Cavs, to the Knicks, and the style that they play, that I legitimately thought the Pacers are going to win this series. And to me, the big thing is, I agree with your points on the structure of the team and what you look for in the playoffs. But the biggest thing with this Pacers team is they just don't have a glaring weakness. And I think that's what we're moving into in this new era of the NBA, where super teams are basically dead. And there's been so much talk about aprons and the CBA. I think the big thing in team building now is you need to minimize your weaknesses. You can't have one glaring thing that teams can pick at. You can talk about Tyrese Halliburton and knocks on him defensively. He's made some pretty big defensive plays throughout this series. So to me, the biggest thing that stands out about the Pacers, not just the style that they play and how, as we get further removed from 2 days off in between games, even if you're young, that style wears on you. But it's also that there's not one area you can look at and say, well, this is the advantage. This is where we can really beat up on Indiana.
Yeah, no, and that's the one thing is, like, they're both a young team. They're both kind of going through these growing pains, right? Because initially they're both fighting for their first NBA title in franchise history. But I think, and it's kind of funny, before we dig in deep about the Milwaukee Bucks, this is kind of the look of what Adam Silver's NBA is looking like, because he wants parity in the league, right? So what it means is that you got a lot of these small market teams that are trying to grow. They're trying to, produce as many of these young players as possible. But the hardest part is because you and I, we've watched it. We've seen a lot of, the Miami Heat and the LA Lakers and the Boston Celtics, winning the amount of titles and getting into the big show for many times as possible for as much as I can remember watching basketball. But then when I start to watch teams like the Thunder and Pacers, it's kind of a little bit interesting to adjust to. But for diehard basketball fans, we love it, because the fact of it just shows that, like, this is something new. This is interesting. It's not so much of the big money markets that we're always used to seeing be in these big positions, but it does take a little bit of adjusting to. But I just think with Adam Silver, he's trying to put parity in the league, but it's not going to be as easy as it comes, right? Because this is going to be the stuff that might adjust here in the next couple of years down the road if it kind of goes to what he's trying to put into fruition.
Well, I mean, I think the only adjustment is in the next CBA, because with what we've seen here, I think it's pretty clear now that you have 3 years. That is your window. And I mean, you can make a case that the Thunder's year one was last year, not this season, because Shea is going to be due within the next 12 months for the richest contract in NBA history. Chet Holmgren and Jalen Williams are making a combined $20 million this year. So, next offseason is the conversation that Boston is going through now of, okay, Now it's time to pay these guys, and you probably have to break up some deals where we make a lot of 2-for-1 trades just because we have this surplus. So
Yeah.
I do think that's largely here to stay. And, all the talk, even with this Thunder team, of this is the next dynasty. Number one, we jumped the gun on that, as they're 2 losses away from not even getting that first championship. But I just, the Thunder, sure, they have the best chance of doing it of any team we've seen recently, but it's going to be near impossible with this CBA and how tough it is to keep teams together.
Yeah, no, 100%. That's why I think, come this off season, it's going to be really interesting because there's going to be such movements that especially when constructing a roster and then putting together all the right pieces of some teams that kind of missed, a pivotal piece that could have taken them up and over the top. So, thinking about this for the Milwaukee Bucks is, and you've covered this team for as long as you have. And my biggest thing with the Bucks is right after they won the NBA title, right, with Mike Budenholzer at the time, I just think, this team with Giannis, they really made their mark to where they got another NBA title under their belt in the franchise. But something seems to be kind of off with this team. And I don't know what it could be in particular, because once they let Budenholzer go and then they get Adrian Griffin, I was like, well, they're second in the East. It seems like this team's kind of up and on the right track. But then once they moved on from him and get Doc Rivers, I'm just trying to figure out, because there's a bit of some inconsistencies up from here. I can't pinpoint it, myself. But when I look at this, because I love Giannis, I really do. But I also try to look at the construction of the roster and try to pinpoint it to where this team can get back into the finals again and maybe even make a bigger impact. Looking at what the Bucks had done this past season, Justin, is there kind of something you've pinpointed what they need to do better going into next year and potentially make that push?
Well, what they need to do is the way they closed the season in that 8-game win streak, and then the things that worked against the Pacers, that group of players, that's the model for how they need to play go forward. Now, the big challenge there is, taking the Giannis conversation that it's not going to go away. It's seemingly, and there's a lot of fatigue in Milwaukee of, man, we're going through this again when he's never given any indication he wants to leave. But it's not going to exit anytime soon. I mean, next summer, it's going to be the same thing where he's 1 year closer to being a free agent then. But taking him out of it, Bobby Portis has a player option. And if you asked me a year ago, I would say, well, there's definitely more money out there for Bobby Portis than the 12 or 13 million he's making this year. But the fact that not a whole lot of teams have cap space, and we just talked about, the different approach teams are taking to building out their roster. And do you want to shell out close to $20 million for a Bobby Portis type, or is that reserved for a younger player that's a two-way guy that you develop on your own? I'm not sure. Gary Trent Jr. was a very, very valuable piece, especially down the stretch for the Bucks. He's a free agent, and he's a guy that you got for the veteran minimum last year. You're not going to get him for that figure this year. Kevin Porter Jr., a lot of things in his background off the court that kind of led him to the Bucks and the ability to become available in that trade, but he showed you flashes too. So you found pieces that work. And I think that's the big thing too, is what the Bucks had to lean into those last 8 games. And, even though they didn't win in that playoff series against the Pacers, was essentially using Giannis similar to how Denver uses Nikola Jokic, where it's just everything's going to run through this guy. You saw him start to rack up triple doubles and put up some massive stat lines in the regular season and playoffs, but this is how we're going to play. And it's not just surround Giannis with shooters. We got another guy that's kind of my turn, your turn. It's everything is going through Giannis. But now you got a lot of questions with your free agents and keeping those guys. I do think the Bucks do feel really good about their chances to retain every one of those names that I mentioned. And the big thing too is, as long as you have Giannis, you have a chance. And everybody that's made the point of, hey, maybe the Bucks should look into trading Giannis. I mean, number one, I can confidently say the organization is never going to say it's time to trade this guy. It would have to be a Giannis saying, we tried, but it's time to move on here. I think the thing that most people don't understand is, number one, you're not going to get the value back that Giannis has for you, but it's stuff like that too. Like guys like Gary Trent Jr., they're willing to stay here and play for the Bucks as long as Giannis is here. When he leaves, Milwaukee is no longer a destination. It's no longer an attraction for players to come to. We saw that for decades. This was a basketball wasteland until Giannis arrived. And you know, the Fiserv Forum that the Bucks play in, that arena doesn't get built. The Bucks are probably not in Milwaukee if they don't draft Giannis and Giannis doesn't ascend to the levels that he has, because before Giannis, there was no interest, and I'm not being hyperbolic, no interest outside of Milwaukee in the state of Wisconsin, in the Bucks. And now you see it's not a state team to the level of the Packers, but it's become much more of a state team. So that's the other thing in that, it's the value of him as an individual player, but it's the value that he brings certainly financially to the franchise and community, but also those other things. When we talk about how do you fill out a roster, it's easier to convince guys, and we've seen the Bucks do this for the last 4 years, to basically find two guards off the scrap heap and say, well, you get to play next to Giannis, and you're going to have a lot of catch and shoot threes.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's funny because I said this a couple years ago and it's funny you make this point because I even said the same exact thing. This team would not even be in Milwaukee if it wasn't for Giannis. Because to me, I felt like this team could have relocated to Vegas because knowing you have the summer leagues and now they're stamping their mark and on the sports market because of the Raiders and the Golden Knights. And it's like the NBA market could have literally exploded. But because of Giannis being there, it gave them a viable chance, which really kind of, saved more of just the fan base, the culture, and so much more. And it's funny you mentioned this with guards because here's the thing. I love Damian Lillard. I really, really do. And I do believe he still has enough left in the tank to really contribute for this Bucks roster. But my only concern about this is because he is getting up in age. And we know injuries can play a pivotal factor for a team's season. When you look at Dame and when he suffered up the injury, that was kind of just a nick in the armor. And when I look at that, how will Damian Lillard really bounce back this upcoming season? Because this has got to be something that Milwaukee's really paying attention to closely, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was being in the building for Game 4 when that injury occurred. It was the most deflating feeling that we've experienced in the city in quite some time. When Giannis got injured in the conference finals, there's a similar feeling, but that was in Atlanta, and that was a time when we were broadcasting remotely for games, so I wasn't there for that. But you got that kind of pit of like, oh man, now you're going to have to monitor this, and maybe it's a lost season coming up. But with the Dame one, you took Game 3 and you felt like, okay, you're back at home, and now you're going to make this a series, because there was a lot of confidence within that locker room too. They are going to beat the Pacers. We're a different team than we were a year ago. And then when he went down, it was just like somebody let all the air out of the balloon, and you could feel it in there. And there's no way the players didn't feel that as well. Doc Rivers after the game talking about, and you could sense it just emotionally wiped the team to see that happen. I'm not going to doubt Damian Lillard to see the work that he puts in. And as you mentioned, the type of player that he is, but there are some things that you can't avoid when you look at the age, how significant of an injury that this is for anyone, but especially somebody that age, somebody that size, and somebody that's going to rely on the burst that Damian Lillard does to still be able to get into the paint and collapse defenses and find open shooters. So I don't know. I think that's the most curious thing to see. Number one, when does he come back? I think you have to go in with the assumption you're not going to have Damian Lillard play next season. If you get him, great, but you can't hey, maybe he can come back after the All-Star game. Again, if there's anybody that can do it and come back quickly, it's Dame with the work that we've seen him put in. But I just think you have to be realistic with this, with his age. And that's the other tough part where the Bucks are kind of saddled right now is, the phrase gap year that's come up quite a bit. Going back to what you mentioned about the coaching changes, when they hired Doc Rivers at the press conference where they kind of combined them, and John Horst spoke talking about the firing of Adrian Griffin and bringing in Doc Rivers, he had said that without saying and using the words gap year, he basically said they were going into that season kind of viewing it as a gap year and ready to take a step backward. And everyone in the room kind of scoffed at that and thought, there's no way that's the case. They didn't get Damian Lillard until over late fall. It was a week before training camp started. And now I think you can look back at it and say, well, I don't know, maybe. And that's the other big learning from this CBA is teams like the Bucks. You're getting up there now with the Cavs, teams like the Jazz back in the day. You would just keep pouring everything into that roster that you had and keep pushing all the chips further and further out there. And now I just don't think that's going to be possible anymore. That I think you're going to see teams recognize and say, all right, we got to make this a gap year and we have to kind of recoup something. And then we can start to push it in a year or two again. But that's what makes it even more interesting with Dame is when does he come back? What does he look like when he comes back? And why I think you keep hearing gap year coming up. Even as we said, the Bucks feel pretty confident they're going to retain most of those names and obviously keep Giannis, but you're still going to have a $54 million anchor on your roster that, is going to miss at the very least 3/4 of the season.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Final question here before we move on. Because we know the NBA draft is right around the corner. And it was interesting how things really panned out, right? Because I think I was saying this on the show a couple weeks ago. This is the fourth time. Maybe there's been more times this has happened where a team, they let go of a star. The star moves on. So we've seen LeBron James move on from Cleveland to Miami before he returned back. And the Cleveland Cavaliers get the number 1 overall pick, and they get Kyrie Irving. Then we watch Anthony Davis move from New Orleans to go to the Lakers, and they get Zion. And I know what you're thinking, because a lot of people all thought, man, this thing's rigged. And the minute that Luka gets traded from Dallas to the Lakers, Dallas gets the number 1 overall pick, and they could potentially get Cooper Flagg. I thought of it this way, Justin, and I live here in Denver. We're very notorious for scratch tickets. And that's what I feel like the NBA draft lottery's become. It's a scratch ticket type of thing.
Yeah.
Not a lot of percentages are guaranteeable. It's not like the NFL where you could have a losing season, but you get the top 10 every year. And those guys are ready to play by day one. So looking at the Bucks and coming into the NBA draft, is there a position they really want to address? At least somebody that can really make an impact in the next 3 years or so that can help the Milwaukee Bucks and contribute, especially with the tenure with Giannis still being there.
Yeah, well, they only have a second-round pick right now. And, that's basically the story for the Bucks from now until 2030, that they have a pick swap, or they owe their first-rounder this year to the Pelicans in that Drew Holiday trade. They have a pick swap with the Pelicans next year, which – even if you have a gap year, you may be picking right around the same spot, so that's not really going to factor in. And then you got one more to New Orleans, and then you have a first rounder and a pick swap with the Blazers for the Dame trade. So the Bucks, in terms of assets, it's not until 2031 that they can make any trades involving a first rounder. And that same year is when they get a second rounder back in the mix. I do wonder, though, when you look at teams like Brooklyn, for example, that I think has 4 first rounders and they're all lumped in the teens, basically. I don't think Brooklyn is going to draft 4 guys in the first round. And I don't think there's going to be an appetite for somebody that's drafted in the top 5 to say, sure, we'll take 2 of your first rounders for this. So I do wonder, because it's not just the Nets, there's a handful of teams that have multiple picks. If we're going to see teams essentially selling a first rounder, and then if that's the case, teams like the Bucks and teams that have mortgaged some of their future can get in the mix and say, we'll buy a first round pick and we'll get in there and find a player that can help us out down the road. If that's the case, they obviously need a big, because I don't think Brook Lopez is going to be back. He's been very polarizing with Bucks fans. Obviously, he's 37 years old and he plays a certain style of play, but I think he's shown he still has a lot of value. And I think he's going to leave because he has value. And other teams are going to be, hey, this is the final piece that we need for our defense. So if he leaves, your bigs, Jericho Sims, flashed a lot of, signs to say, okay, this guy's pretty good defensively, that you can do some things with him. playing alongside Giannis is going to be a challenge because of his lack of offense. So your bigs would just be, if you keep Jericho Sims, he, Giannis, and if Bobby Portis is back, him. So you're going to need some big depth. And we've been talking about it for at least 5 years. What does life after Brook Lopez look like? At some point, you got to address that. You would think it's with a younger guy that you can develop. So I think that would stick out as number one. But, the other learnings that I think you have from the playoffs is you need creators and guys that can handle the ball, because it wasn't as bad this past season. The year before, the Bucks ball handlers were basically Damian Lillard, Chris Middleton, and Giannis. So if one of those guys didn't have the ball, the Pacers were trapping and pressuring them, and you saw a lot of turnovers. You got to get further and further away from that. So I think the big needs are a big, and then just more guys that, not necessarily point guards, but just guys that can handle the ball and initiate offense.
Yeah, 100%. I'm just really curious what this team, they're going to do this offseason. Maybe
I will say this. I don't think they're going to sit on their hands. I mean, I think, and look, the Dame injury is one thing, but what you cannot understate is, as beloved as Chris Middleton was, and look, the trade on the court did not work out, to at least last year, what you got in Kyle Kuzma. But it opened up a lot of things because it got you under the second apron and it got you a little more cap flexibility. If they don't make that trade and Damian Lillard still suffers that injury, then I do wonder what the future is like for Giannis. And if we have a different conversation, because then you're a second apron team once again, where all you've got is veteran minimums that you can dole out to try to reshape this roster. And, other guys see that too. And guys like Gary Trent and Bobby Portis say, you know what? I don't think it's going to happen here. I think we're ready to move on. So I do think they're going to be very active. And, that's what we've seen in John Horst, is that even though it didn't work out, Jay Crowder, you kept mentioning that name of, could they get Jay Crowder? You didn't think they had enough to get him. They did. Same with PJ Tucker, where they traded DJ Wilson and draft picks to get PJ Tucker. And Dame, everybody started mentioning that name late in the offseason and kept thinking, yeah, I would love to see Dame with Giannis, but the Bucks don't have the assets to get Dame. And they did. Drew Holiday, same story. So there's been all these moves that you would look at and say, I just don't think the Bucks could offer the best package. And yet they end up with the guy. So I do think John Horst is going to have something cooking once again this offseason.
Yeah, it should be interesting. Justin, appreciate you for coming on by, man. Where can people find you? Tapping on in for our audiences here, getting locked in on the Milwaukee Bucks this season.
Yeah, you mentioned it, the Locked On Bucks podcast. You can find me there all season long. Justin Garcia, NBA on Twitter, and then during the season on the Bucks Radio Network.
All right. Appreciate it, man. Have a great rest of the week, man. And we shall see what the Bucks do this offseason, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Anytime.
Absolutely. All right. We are moving in fast. We're turning two, as usual, as a baseball fan. So moving on real quick to here.